Welcome everyone to this special live stream panel event titled Inside Out, How COVID-19 is Shifting Our Sense of Places and Spaces and What This Means in a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Sara Kirk and I'm the Scientific Director of the Healthy Populations Institute and a founding fellow with the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie University. I'll be your moderator for this panel, which is co-hosted by the Healthy Populations Institute, the MacEachen Institute, and Dalhousie Alumni Engagement. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University is in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Today's panel continues the dialogue that has been taking place across Canada as we grapple with the impact of COVID-19 during and post-lockdown. On that note, I'd like to draw your attention to the MacEachen Institute's COVID-19 speaker panel series, as well as the Dalhousie Alumni Open Dialogue Live series, which are available for viewing on their respective websites and YouTube channels. These have covered a range of topics related to the societal impacts of COVID-19 locally and globally. And the COVID-19 pandemic has turned our world literally inside out. It has forced us to examine our relationship with our homes and workspaces as they become one, and to consider the impact for those experiencing precarious housing or employment, or with limited access to the outdoors. During this unique time, and in light of the necessary physical distancing directives to keep us safe, this panel asks the questions: what has the lockdown meant to Canadian communities, and what will our future look like post-pandemic? As we begin to ease restrictions, how do we ensure that we balance health and well-being and create places and spaces that work for everyone? Our panelists will offer perspectives on the background to the current pandemic, how the public can engage with the built and natural environments, and how policymakers can create space for that engagement in post-pandemic life in ways that are equitable and limit our chances of another pandemic. I will introduce all the panelists now, and each will have around 10 minutes to make their points, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. You can submit your questions by emailing them to hpi@dal.ca, or you can provide them via our Facebook Live feeds. But please be sure to address your comments to a specific panel member so that we can facilitate the discussion. So our first panelist is Dr. Daniel Raynham, an Associate Professor at Dalhousie University and the Elizabeth May Chair in Sustainability and Environmental Health. Daniel works with a fantastic team of trainees and colleagues to explore the relationships between the quality of our environment and human health. His research is focused on measuring the characteristics of the environment and experimenting with solutions and interventions toward a healthier, sustainable lifespan. Next, we'll hear from Robin Mazumder, an accomplished keynote speaker sought out internationally to provoke thoughtful discussions on cities and well-being. He is currently completing his doctorate in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo, where he is studying the psychological impacts of urban design. Using sophisticated wearable technology and immersive virtual reality, he examines how people experience urban design and architecture. Robin's research is funded by the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship, which is Canada's most prestigious doctoral award. Our third panelist is Crystal Watson, Executive Director of Recreation Nova Scotia. Crystal has spent the last 20 plus years in the recreation field, working with individuals from various backgrounds. She is a two-time Dalhousie alum, having studied therapeutic recreation as an undergraduate and a master's in leisure studies. After a number of years working in community recreation, she practiced as a recreational therapist for 10 years in various clinical settings and in junior high schools. She is currently a PhD in health candidate at Dalhousie University, pursuing her research interest in understanding the play experiences of African Nova Scotian children. Our final panelist is Lisa Roberts, who was elected for the NDP as the MLA for Halifax Needham in an August 2016 by-election and re-elected in 2017. Her electoral district largely encompasses the diverse and vibrant neighbourhood known as the North End of Halifax. In the years before her election, Lisa worked for several years in the non-profit sector and had an earlier career as a journalist, primarily with CBC Radio. She has a Master's in Development Economics and a BA in International Development Studies, both from Dalhousie University. She currently serves on the Public Accounts Committee of the Nova Scotia Legislature and is NDP spokesperson on housing. So we'll go to you first, Daniel, to start us off.
Thank you, Sarah. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm grateful to be invited to speak with you and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I also extend the appreciation to the MacEachen and Healthy Populations Institutes for organizing this event, and to Dalhousie's Office of Advancement for coordinating engagement with Dalhousie's fantastic alumni community. The title of today's panel event contains two important terms, I believe, assist in contextualizing some of the ideas I'm about to share. These terms are space and place. In the discipline of health geography, these terms have very specific meanings, even though they're used interchangeably in everyday life. Space is really about location and can be described several ways, including the use of coordinates such as latitude and longitude, or even a civic address. Sometimes we also use the terms to describe size or extent or the feeling about a space, like your workspace. Place, on the other hand, is different than space. Place is the meaning we attach to spaces. Space is to place as a house is to home. The house as a physical object is important, but the notion of home conjures meaning through memories, experiences, emotions, and so on. In the short time I have with you today, I'm going to talk about Earth, our home, and the environments we live in as the place in which we develop, thrive, and remain healthy as a species. First, I'll talk about the emergence of infectious pathogens and how emergence is related to how we interact with nature. Second, we'll look at some of the factors that facilitate the spread of disease and look at some of the trends driving disease emergence. And finally, I'll provide you with a few ideas on what I think we need to do to prevent or reduce the risk of future pandemics and to redefine our relationship with our home. You can see from this infographic that emerging diseases, the pandemics and the health costs they inflict, are not new to our species. Many historical pandemics had enormous impact on societies around the world. And over time, due to improvements in sanitation, public health practices, and advances in medical care and treatments, we've been able to reduce the spread and in some cases the lethality of many emerging diseases. However, the rate of emergence of new diseases have been increasing. Over the last 40 years, at least 50 emerging infectious agents have been identified. Most are viruses and about 10% are bacterial agents. The first pandemic of the 21st century, you may remember, was SARS, which spread to 29 countries and resulted in 774 deaths from almost 8,100 cases. In epidemiology, we sometimes talk about the spark risk and the spread risk. The first step that has to happen is something changes, usually caused by human beings, that brings us into close contact with wildlife. And usually these species carry pathogens that are not normally transmitted to people. But recurring contact and other factors can result in genetic changes so that the pathogens can be transmitted to humans. These are the zoonoses. Similar to COVID-19, the spark for SARS is thought to have occurred in wet markets where wild and domestic animals are to believe the source of human transmission. But ultimately, bats are suspected to be the sylvatic reservoir. The spread risk is influenced by characteristics of the pathogen, population density, and mobility, as well as the speed and effectiveness of surveillance and response measures. It's estimated that about 60% of infectious diseases found in people are spread by animals, both in the wild and animals in captivity that we farm as a source of protein. For this slide, I put together a plot showing trends in disease outbreaks, human population, gross domestic product, and two indicators of ecological health, the percent of forested land cover globally and the Living Planet Index. Each of these indicators I referenced to 1980, so you can compare trends over time to 2013. The blue line represents an increase in the number of disease cases beyond expectations for a given population, and I actually log transformed that data. So it's actually a lot greater than you think. It would be off the top of the plot. The number of outbreaks, like the number of emerging infectious diseases, appears to be increasing with both time and total number and richness of causal diseases. Interestingly, outbreak cases per capita appear to be declining over time, and that suggests that despite an increase in overall outbreaks, global improvements in prevention, early detection, control, and treatment are becoming more effective at reducing the number of people infected. Our populations and economies continue to grow. People are living longer and fewer children die at birth than ever before. These are good things. However, evidence suggests that the likelihood of pandemics has increased over the past century due to exploitation of the natural environment, which is in part linked to how we measure a healthy economy. According to the Zoological Society of London and the World Wildlife Fund, populations of more than 4,000 species are less than half of what they were about 45 years ago. Over that time, emissions of CO2 have risen from 325 to 415 parts per million. And Philip Curtis from the University of Arkansas estimates about 12.4 million acres of forests, almost an area the size of Nova Scotia, every year are permanently converted to growing commodity crops such as palm oil every year. Our activities are resulting in a less healthy planet, the place we call home, and creating a hostile environment for many other species on which we depend. The issue of climate change, for example, is really a symptom of a much larger illness related to how we interact with nature. So what can we do about this? Can the COVID-19 experience be a catalyst for changing our relationship with nature? There's a growing recognition that better prevention and control of zoonotic diseases could be achieved by addressing the underlying factors that facilitate their emergence and spread. Ultimately, risk from emerging pathogens will be reduced by changing our relationship with each other, with other species, and the habitats that support all life. When we think about health, many of us immediately reflect on healthcare. No one would dispute the importance of healthcare in society, but emphasis in healthcare reflects a reactionary approach to disease caused by factors mainly untreatable by the healthcare domain. Sure, we can react to future pandemics. A great article in Science magazine lays it all out for you for bird flu. First of all, you put together a surveillance task force. Then you develop interventions like vaccines and antivirals. And then you develop better epidemiological models. These are sound strategies, but ignore and fail to acknowledge the upstream driving forces that lead to the emergence of pathogens like COVID-19. In addition to traditional approaches, we should consider the idea of One Health or planetary health perspectives. This will require recognition of the interrelationships between human, animal, and environmental conditions, how all species and the environment are interconnected. There are lots of opportunities for change, things we can do right now. First, we should change our economic system to take nature into account. This would mean investing in aspects of our economy that reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and toxic substances. Second, we should explore how other worldviews and perspectives view human development and may provide insight into reducing socioeconomic inequalities. Greater equality may lessen impact on natural systems, particularly in fringe habitats where species harbor different pathogens that we haven't been exposed to. Third, we need to reconnect with nature and natural systems. You and I spend more than 90% of our time indoors and have become so urbanized to the point of losing our connection with the natural world. Going back to the ideas of space and place, we need to think about nature as a place within which we develop, not a space from which to procure resources. To me, it's ironic that the people on the planet who have the largest impact on natural systems, me, you, and possibly others on this call right now, may also be the most disconnected from nature and how nature works. And they may be least impacted by pandemics in the future. At a minimum, we have an obligation to be more thoughtful stewards of the natural world, our home. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thanks everyone for having me. Hello to my virtual audience. It's a little odd talking into a camera, but hopefully we get some good discussion afterwards. So at first I'll provide a bit of context about what I do and how I see the current pandemic and its relation to urban design and well-being. So I'm currently just finishing my PhD in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo, where I study the psychological impacts of urban design. So, how space and place in our cities shapes how we feel and function. And within that, I study proxemics, so how people organize the space around them, the space they keep between themselves and others, and the built environment, which I didn't realize how relevant, I guess, that would be in this current context when we're all very conscious of our personal space. And I also examine the dynamics between power and architecture and how that shapes our lives. And this interest was actually informed by my clinical work as an occupational therapist. I spent about 5 years working in a variety of mental health contexts with people with mental health issues. And it was during that time that I really began to appreciate and think about how the built environment of the city related to how people functioned and felt, and how that may contribute to mental illness. And I'll say a little bit about OTs. Some people may not know. So occupational therapists really try to focus their work on helping people engage in what we call occupations, which is just another term for meaningful activities. And so you could see how, you know, your day-to-day lives within this context of a pandemic could be seen through the lens of occupational therapy. We've all experienced significant disruption to the things that we value, the things that we do, and that has had impacts on how we're feeling and how we're functioning. And OTs also pay particular attention to the environment. So that's, I guess, one way of distinguishing occupational therapy from other healthcare professions. And some of the models that we look at really try to understand how someone's environment impedes or promotes their ability to participate in these activities that support well-being. And it was actually when I was an OT that I started to recognize how the layout of our cities was actually quite a significant determinant of well-being. You know, I worked with a number of people who lived under the poverty line, and when I looked at how the neighborhoods that they lived in were laid out, I saw how, and most of them also experienced significant social isolation and loneliness, which, you know, amplified their mental health issues. And so I saw there how, you know, urban design from the perspective of urban public space to the infrastructure that allowed people to travel through their communities, whether that would be transit or cycling, and how that would all kind of work together to, you know, impact how people dealt with their mental health issues, which is what motivated me to start my PhD, to look at this question in more depth. So how does this relate to what we're dealing with right now? I'm sure many of you have felt quite claustrophobic for the last, I guess we're almost at about 2 months that this has been going on, it seems. But your experience of that pressure varies with your socioeconomic status and the access that you have to public space, or even the access that you have within your own private space, the amount of space, interior space that you have to live in, to your own, perhaps your own private backyard. And I think that has some pretty serious implications on equity, particularly around the conversation on public space. We've seen in cities across Canada a number of approaches to addressing the issue and the necessity for physical and social distancing, from either completely shutting down public spaces and policing them, to opening streets up to give people more space to occupy on the street so that they can physically distance while, you know, getting out for recreation or leisure purposes, or accessing amenities within their communities. And I've been a little disappointed by some of what I've seen. I know some cities have changed their tune in the recent weeks, but the approach to dealing or trying to promote physical distancing that involves policing people, I think, has had some pretty significant impacts, particularly on people who might live in a I guess a lower income bracket, and people who might be sharing an apartment with a number of their family members. Maybe there's, you know, more people than there are rooms, and people who don't have their own private green space. And so for people within these circumstances, public green space is extremely important. And we know that, you know, particularly when it comes to race and class, and we need an intersectional approach to what we're talking about here. So recognizing how someone's identity informs how they experience the city, but recognizing that race and class intersect, particularly in that, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been shown to be disproportionately affected by this pandemic. And then you couple that with the disparities in health and well-being that already exist for people for people of color, typically, and also people who live within a lower socioeconomic status bracket. You can see how by policing people into not using public space, how that will only serve to amplify the existing disparities. And so I know it's really easy for people to opine and moralize about people staying at home and not being in parks, but I think it's important to examine who's making these statements and the privilege that they have in doing so. And so I would advocate for cities to continue to open streets. So we're seeing trends where cities are, closing down car lanes to create more space for people to walk and cycle in their communities, or use mobility aids, and also for public space or green space to be left open. But I think we also, again, need an equity lens on that. Some cities have chosen to keep or open their streets within core areas in the city. Typically, these areas in the city are more affluent, and it might be one or two streets. I think that is problematic on, two major fronts, one of which is you're creating novelty. So you're just driving people to these areas, which is almost counterintuitive. And secondly, again, using that equity lens, we have to ask ourselves where we're placing these open streets. And I would encourage that cities do this across the entirety of the city, not just in the central areas, because everyone requires that extra space. I mean, I'm living in the west side suburban area of Edmonton, and it's not the core, but people are still walking into the road to adequately physically distance. And I just want to kind of end with recognizing again that we can advocate for open streets and open parks, but the policing aspect, again, is something that's really, really important. What people consider to be safe, what a safe street means for people varies greatly, as you've known recently from the news in the United States. The sad news of what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, who was just going for a run was basically shot down by white supremacists, and extending that into the issue with carting and whatnot. So as we continue to advocate for open streets, I think it's also important that we continue to push for more justice for people who are marginalized and experience significant oppression. And thanks, and I look forward to the conversation we have after.
Hi, I'm Crystal and happy to be here. So thanks to the Healthy Populations Institute and the MacEachen Institute of Public Policy and Dalhousie alumni for this invitation. And I'm very pleased to share with you my thoughts on the impact of COVID-19 on the recreation sector. As Sara introduced, I had the privilege to work in the recreation sector for a number of years in various capacities, and I chose to title my contribution today, Pandemic Realizations, the High Cost of No Fun, because more often than not, recreation professionals, the work they do, the spaces they care for is taken for granted. And what was discovered during this pandemic, in most crisis situations, people realized the critical role that recreation plays in their lives, whether it's going to the theater or museum, or for our focus today on outdoor spaces and places to walk, bike, or hike. These spaces are often our lifeline, and we assume that they will always be available to us, and yet neglect those that maintain those spaces or provide ideas to enhance our experiences within them. So I'd just like to recognize all of the recreation professionals and volunteers in community and clinical settings for doing their very best to meet the needs of those they serve. In my previous life as a recreation therapist, lockdowns and isolation situations because of viruses were not uncommon. And I'm super proud of my colleagues who are on the front lines, supporting individuals in healthcare environments, working to ensure that their social, physical, and emotional needs of those residents are attended to. So those of us who have studied the history of recreation and leisure know that recreation opportunities have been front and center in times of conflict, and that there are many individuals and organizations that have made it their purpose to advocate for the provision of recreation opportunities to help people cope with the challenges that they are facing at that time. Recreation activities have known therapeutic benefits. It's the social, physical, and emotional benefits that are what motivates folks to participate in them. The sense of community and connection, improved physical health, and decreased mental stress are only a few of the reasons why recreation is so important to our lives. However, like I mentioned, when encountered with barriers to participation, we think about what to do next. When parks and trails and other outdoor spaces are closed, in addition to everything else leisure related, an overwhelming sense of despair seems to befall us. While having to adjust to new work routines, we also had to figure out how to manage our leisure lives. Would it even be a priority anymore? Change came quickly, and we all know that adapting to change is not always easy. At that point, we start to reflect not only on what to do and how to do it differently, but thinking about all those things that were part of our lives that we took for granted, including those outdoor recreation spaces and places that we now long for. Parks and trails closures amplified our need to access outdoor spaces in our immediate neighborhoods and, if possible, our own backyards. Luckily, we have recreation professionals that are accustomed to adapting, and what many have accomplished for their communities has been nothing short of remarkable. We have seen an increase in virtual programming, fitness, crafts, even trivia is being offered by some communities. As well, we've seen an increase in nature-based activity programming that provides opportunities for education, as well as appreciation of the outdoor spaces and places that we access. Activities like identifying birds and trees in the neighborhood. And of course, I'm a fan of outdoor and now indoor loose parts play, allowing children to play with whatever is handy without structure and direction. Yet in all the good, we cannot forget that this pandemic has further highlighted the inequities that exist in accessing recreation, leaving many without or unable to participate in many offerings such as online programming. Again, recreation practitioners have been considering all these factors as they reimagine recreation now and into the future. Some of whom have implemented delivering recreation kits to families in their communities, or are brainstorming ways to offer neighborhood-centered experiences and regular calls to their patrons. By now, most of our open spaces are available for folks to utilize, and the decision was well received by public. However, we learned that there's much more that happens behind the scenes to ensure that those spaces are available for folks to enjoy. At the municipal level, many seasonal staff were not hired right away, so there were delays. However, it did not shake the commitment of recreation and parks practitioners and volunteers to make those spaces available. Social distancing rules still needed to be adhered to for both staff and volunteers, and now protocols are being developed to ensure safe use. So now we think about what is next, and I offer these few recommendations. We need to strategize to avoid closure of parks and trails, period. We know that some provinces did not close their parks and trails. So what can we learn from those particular decisions? Is it about signage or staffing? Is there a need for more education? Whatever those challenges are, we know that we need to work together to develop a plan so that if this were to happen again, that we can have a consistent approach and maintain access. Avoiding closures is very much connected to the health benefits of recreation and outdoor recreation specifically. Much has been discussed in the literature about the benefits of outdoor recreation pursuits, and this is specifically related to our mental health. And I'm sure what other folks experienced, at least what I've experienced over this period of time, is that navigating through this pandemic has been traumatic. So having a place to go for tranquility and escape is just one of the mechanisms for how we cope with traumatic events. We need to educate and collaborate with planning professionals. And I've been thinking specifically about how do we design and perhaps redesign neighborhoods that support active transportation and create spaces for outdoor play. There are definitely opportunities for education and collaboration between recreation and planning professionals. We need to influence multi-sectoral policy development. This pandemic highlighted that two different sectors may be experiencing the same barriers when it comes to addressing the needs of people they serve. So how can we work together, for instance, to address internet access? Finally, we need to honor the expertise of recreation and park practitioners. Once again, I'll say we need to recognize that we all have our thing, and that the expertise that recreation professionals could bring to some conversations would ensure diversity of thought and decision-making. And we need this now more than ever as we work through these challenging times. Thanks for listening.
Hi, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have listened already to Daniel, Robin, and Crystal. I am going to speak, I guess, about the public stake in private space, which has become really evident through this COVID-19 period. And I'll speak largely informed by my experience of the last several years as the NDP's housing spokesperson here in Nova Scotia. There's been a pretty widely reported, robust international conversation about the trend towards increased wealth inequality. And I think what COVID-19 has done is made more plain, more obvious what was true before, and it's also exacerbated some tensions and inequalities that were already present. And when I think about space, I think about that unequal access to space, and the fact that one significant way that people hold wealth is actually by accumulating space in the form of real estate. I mean, there's a couple different ways that it happens, because also if you think about who can cross borders, who can travel and potentially be a vector for a spread of infection, that is actually a reality that is only available to some people. But also in our community, those same people who have the potential of easily crossing borders and easily and not intentionally becoming a vector of infection, they also, when they return, are more likely to have access to a safe and adequate personal private space in which to socially isolate. And in Halifax, and here in Nova Scotia, where we were already faced with a really tight housing market before COVID-19, I've been paying particular attention to this unequal access to private space, and the trend towards again that using of space as an accumulation of wealth. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that real estate is being treated as a financial asset. You know, when my parents bought their first home, I think the interest rate was like 14 or 17%, something like that. They talk about it. And it was the biggest investment of their lives to that point, and it took forever to pay down that mortgage. Well, now, you know, we've had interest rates as low as they can possibly be since 2008, yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but it's been a long time that interest rates have been really low. And so, you know, investing in real estate, where in hot markets, the value of real estate is going up faster than the real estate of other kinds of investment, has been really attractive. And so here in Halifax, one day this winter, it was reported in All Nova Scotia, which is a business, you know, subscriber-only publication, that 3,000 apartment units in Halifax traded hands between two different institutional investors. And many of those are organized as real estate investment trusts. And for those entities, you know, the financial equation of owning a property. It's no longer just about paying a mortgage or, you know, putting aside enough for property management and replacing the roof that is going to need to be replaced after 30 years. It's also about providing that return to shareholders that is significant and adequate to fund pensions or whatever you know, the interest is in owning this financial asset. So let me take a breath. So in January of this year, the latest CMHC rental report showed that a fifth of Nova Scotian households were spending more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities, that there was a 1% vacancy rate, and that rents were up 4% from the previous year. And in fact, the regulatory environment in Nova Scotia, where there is absolutely no rent control, makes it an all the more attractive environment in which to invest. And there are demand side factors like an increase in immigration and in migration from other parts of the maritime provinces. And in fact, from higher, more expensive jurisdictions within Canada. I've met, you know, folks from British Columbia now living in non-market housing, nonprofit housing in Halifax because they just couldn't afford to retire where they had spent their lives. So there's a bunch of demand side factors, but there's also supply side factors. The fact that we haven't invested in social market housing in Nova Scotia in decades, and that we haven't regulated short-term rentals, which in parts of my constituency had basically evaporated 2% of the market, 2% of the housing units, leaving 1% vacancies. So all of that was a circumstance before COVID, and then we told people to shelter in place, to stay at home. The shelters in Nova Scotia were full in the fall, and they were beyond capacity in the winter. That circumstance, when COVID hit, led to kind of the one significant provincial government response in the homelessness sector, which was to fund the establishment of 3 pop-up shelters, so that the permanent shelters, where in one case there are more than 50 men sleeping in bunk beds in 2 rooms, would be able to comply with public health guidelines for social distancing. And so we ended up with 3 gymnasiums with cots, so that there would be space for people experiencing homelessness. But that is necessary, not adequate in the longer term, and we're now 8 weeks into this with no real clear end in sight. And it's also another transfer of public dollars into private hands without any acquisitions of assets, without any acquisition of new social market housing. In Nova Scotia right now, less than 10% of the housing market is in the social market. So the social market would include public housing, cooperative housing, and nonprofit housing. And in fact, we've been seeing this resorting to paying public dollars to private sector without acquiring assets for years, certainly under the current provincial government, which has been in power for 2 terms now, so that, you know, rent supplements are the go-to. And I think it's worth, you know, in this pandemic space, in this pandemic moment, to really recognize the public stake that we all have in people having adequate private space. You know, when we say we're all in this together, it's because I need you and all of my neighbors to have a place to wash your hands, to have a space to go and be sick without infecting others. And so it's worth just highlighting 2 jurisdictions where things are very different. One where it's been different for a longer time is Helsinki, Finland, where 70% of the land is owned by the municipal government, which is kind of more like a provincial level here in Canada. where there's a public developer that constructs 7,000 units annually, and where the city owns 60,000 units, and where in every neighborhood there's more or less a breakdown of 25% social market housing units, 45% private sector units, and the stuff in the middle is owned by individuals, you know, who in some cases resort to some subsidies to be able to purchase. And there isn't a visible difference between one sector and the other sector. Helsinki is also the place where Housing First was pioneered. That is a philosophy with lots of great evidence behind it, that where people are experiencing homelessness and maybe also addiction or maybe also mental illness, the first thing that you have to do is get them housed. And so they pioneered that. We have it in Halifax, but only for 50 individuals with one pot of federal funding. So it's been full for 2 years, and there's no new funding coming to expand that approach. Meanwhile, in Vancouver, in September 2017, the provincial government committed $66 million to construct modular housing. In March of 2019, there were more than 600 units built. With that commitment, which I'll just say is, you know, approximately what we're spending in Nova Scotia for a new highway interchange. 600 new units built, 80% of those occupied by people who had previously experienced homelessness, been living in the streets or in shelters. And that's what's possible in a relatively short timeline. So I hope that we can re-examine what we are getting collectively from the 20% of our GDP in Canada, which is represented by real estate, and think about how we actually invest in a well-being economy and invest and value and recognize the public stake that we all have in people having adequate private space. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks everyone for that great overview of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing. We're going to take some questions now. I'm going to ask, first of all, well, actually, I'm going to take the opportunity as the moderator to ask each of you this question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So we've seen the best and the worst of people during this pandemic. You know, that really applies, I think, to the way that we've allocated space or not. And I wonder if you can, you know, come up with your sort of your dream moving forward, if you like. So what can we do to be sure that we take the best and we leave the worst behind us? So we'll start in the order of presentation. So Daniel, do you want to? What's your kind of wish list, if you like, for moving forward?
Well, I'm not sure how to respond to that question. You know, given my background in epidemiology, I feel that, you know, to some degree, we still lack preparedness at many levels in being able to deal with these kinds of events effectively. The reaction, which I suppose is a conservative reaction in many locations in Canada anyways, was to lock down and create sort of extreme conditions of social isolation. I don't think we fully understand what the impacts of that are yet, particularly for some of the populations that have been identified by other speakers, who are in circumstances experiencing social isolation, who may be in poverty and so on, who don't have adequate or secure housing or food security and so on. My worry is that it's amplified to some degree some of the potential mental health and other outcomes that are experienced in those populations. So I'd like to think that, you know, in the future, we have lots to learn from this experience. And part of that is going to be, in my opinion, thinking about ways where we can invest a little more in, even though I said we need to invest upstream, we also need to invest in being able to react a little bit better, I think with more precision in terms of how we trace potential infections, how we trace contacts, and how we think more about, do we need to isolate the whole population, or are there ways in which we can improve our approaches to allow some people more latitude in how they experience the world around them? Are they able to get outside and so on? And also be more in tune with some of those populations who are less fortunate and may not have the same latitude to do that.
Great, thank you. Robin, what's on your wish list? You're on mute.
My apologies. Yeah, I have a few things on my wish list. Like I mentioned in my little 10-minute blurb there, that a lot of cities are moving to rapidly transform their streets. And I think what that has shown me is that urban transformation doesn't need to take decades, like we see oftentimes in cycling master plans. There's like a 20-year plan or something like that to make minimal changes to our urban environment. Milan has, I think they're rolling out hundreds of kilometers. Paris is rolling out hundreds of kilometers basically overnight. And so we're really seeing how, I would say easy, but possible it is in a short amount of time. So I hope that sticks. I hope that these open streets that we've, created to give people more space remain. It's something that I've been noticing for a long time. Even like, I think last year I was out for a walk and I saw two women pushing their strollers, and one of them had to walk on the street in the painted bike lane so that she could walk alongside her friend. And this is pre-pandemic. So I think this pandemic is really showing us how little space we have and how much we probably unnecessarily contribute to or give to cars, their storage and their movement. Another change, I'll be quick, that I really would love to see more of, and this might offend some people, it started a Twitter war a few weeks ago, but San Francisco chose to open their golf courses, their public golf courses, to become park space. And San Francisco is a city that has huge disparity on affordable housing. So obviously they need to use space, or they need to use that space in a better way. And it reminded me, I read this paper a couple of weeks ago, just finishing up my dissertation, and it was about the history of open space. And I didn't realize that in London, the majority of the parks or the squares that people can access now actually started as private gardens for the rich who escaped the plague in the late 1600s to move out more west from the city of London around Bloomsbury. And only about 300 years later, those spaces became available for public use. And it really made me kind of contemplate to think about what we're doing with space, particularly when it comes to golf spaces in cities, and how that may intersect with class and who's accessing those spaces. And so the last point I'll make is, I think that particularly as it pertains to active transportation, we should situate this within a more broader conversation on climate change. Obviously, we need a systemic approach to this pandemic, and we'd be remiss not to acknowledge how climate change and a complex system has contributed to the creation of this virus as well as its propagation. So, yeah, to sum it up, keep the open streets open, and maybe think about how we use green space, particularly golf courses within the cores of our cities.
Great, thank you. Crystal, what's on your wish list?
I have a pretty lofty goal, and I think it just relates back to conversations that I've had with colleagues over the years, and particularly those in community recreation. And it just relates a lot to equity and bringing back recreation as a public good. And so whatever that might involve in terms of ensuring that everybody has access to recreation opportunities and outdoor spaces, and creating communities that are healthy. I think that for me is a very broad brush approach to trying to build healthier communities that would have such a far-reaching impact if we're able to do that in terms of our physical, social, and mental health. So yeah, I think that's probably my wish list.
Great, thank you. And Lisa, what's your dream?
I've been really impressed by some of the solidarity responses I've seen at a neighborhood level, and I think and hope that some of those relationships that have been established, in my neighborhood, there's been a lot of informal organizing around delivering food support, particularly for seniors who are socially isolated. And I hope that those relationships can continue and be deepened. I'd love to keep a lot of virtual meetings. I think I don't find it particularly satisfying for social gatherings, though actually even for that, it's kind of okay, but, reducing the amount that we feel like we need to travel in order to work collaboratively. I think we've seen amazing work around the globe on, on the epidemiology, on building respirators. Clearly a lot can happen without people actually flying and gathering. And so, yeah, I'd like to keep the clean skies that have resulted from that. And my kids are really interested in continuing to see lower carbon emissions because, yeah, they think about climate change all the time.
Great. Thank you all.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Warren yet.
Yeah, we've got some questions rolling in. The first one is from Jennifer. It's for Robin and Crystal. How do we balance the need to allow people access to outdoor recreational spaces with the need to reinforce public health measures like social distancing? And then furthermore, how do we not police those who have a genuine need to be in shared outdoor space, but at the same time, get through to those who seem to disregard the rules?
Crystal, would you like to go or do you want me to go?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, sure. Then have some panel etiquette in the virtual space. I don't want to just start talking. I think something that I've been thinking a lot about that I've seen when we've been talking, on social media, talking about the risk of opening up streets or the risk of opening up parks is what I think is the misapplication of the theory of induced demand. I mean, induced demand has been basically, if you build, it's been used in like highway transportation and road widening. So the idea is if you build wider roads, you're just going to have more people driving on them, which has been shown to be true when it comes to commuters traveling between cities. But I think that, induced demand is an economic principle that assumes rational actors and people acting as robots. And I don't think really appreciates the complexity of a human being. And Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work around, he was a neuroscientist that moved into economics, and he won the Nobel Prize for economics, trying to challenge the notion of economic models as not really acknowledging the psychological components of how people act. So to answer the question, I think, when we're talking about balancing the need, I think people generally are rational and reasonable. And the problem, I think, is that we don't have enough space. And so I think if we give people adequate space and like Crystal was mentioning around signage, how do we, communicate how these spaces should be used? I think people, Toronto shut down Hyde Park last week because of the cherry blossoms. They were worried about people flocking, and they just reopened Hyde Park, and I think things are okay. I think people get the intensity of the situation. I think we're always going to have people who don't follow the rules for whatever reason. Either they don't understand the rules or they're being intentionally defiant. But for the vast majority of people, I think we can trust that they'll act appropriately. And to speak to the issue around policing, I think that starts with the police. I think we have to have a bigger conversation about the role that police play in our cities. Desmond Cole in Toronto, I really appreciate the work that he's done around highlighting the issue of carding. He's been at it for a long time. And only now in the recent years, we've seen them an actual conversation and some reports out on the disproportionate, how black people in Toronto are disproportionately affected by policing. So yeah, I like I said before, I'm kind of worried about the implications of policing if we continue on the way it is. I mean, it's not good already within the context of a pandemic and giving someone an excuse just to arrest somebody or harass them because, you know, whatever bias that officer might have is scary. So I'd rather approach this from a positive perspective and a proactive perspective that gives these people the space they need so they don't feel like they need to congregate in the small spaces in our cities.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with Robin, and I would say that, you know, just in terms of ensuring that people can access space, I feel like we haven't been given enough opportunity to really explore our neighborhoods. We tend to be so worried about being productive in other things that we very rarely take that opportunity to appreciate the spaces and places in which we live. And pretty much like Lisa said in terms of her wish list around, you know, not taking that opportunity to, you know, fly or maybe even drive a lot of places. I think if we set up the infrastructure or provide the infrastructure where people are able to, from the very beginning, to explore their spaces, then I think we have a better chance of seeing more folks, I don't want to say comply, but to be a little bit more conscious of the people around them and try and deal with, you know, how we respond to pandemics and those sorts of things, because I really feel that so much of people's the way they were able to manage themselves in the pandemic was quite very much related to the fact that there were boundaries put on them in the first place. And granted, those are public health restrictions that we have to adhere to. But without that opportunity of being able to explore, okay, so what is it that can stay open, that we can ensure that people have access to, that we can create some plans around, so that folks can be safe. I don't think that those conversations were had, and we could probably do that now. In terms of policing, it's a hard topic, particularly because I identify as a woman of African descent, and so the whole police ideology is something that we need to have some discussions around, because there are folks that are disproportionately impacted by that, and until we are really able to accept that is happening, then, you know, that whole policing people's lives and policing people's use of space is going to be very challenging, and so we need to be able to, you know, combat some of those ideologies by having those open conversations and being able to accept that those I guess discriminatory policies exist.
Okay, we have a question for Daniel. In your opinion, what are the most important lessons from the current slowed down economy due to the pandemic, thinking into the future of tackling the ongoing climate crisis?
That's an excellent question. Some of us have been observing some of the consequences or results of the change in air traffic patterns and the use of private automobiles and so on. And we're gathering over time quite good evidence that there's been a significant reduction, for example, in concentrations of several types of air pollutants, not just in urban areas, but across North America and in many other jurisdictions as well. So it's been a global reduction, at least for those areas that have implemented measures to create isolation for public health purposes, have resulted in sort of a cleaning of the airspace around them. And I think one of the there has been also some work around whether or not air pollution those areas that had higher air pollution beforehand put people at greater risk because they may have been more compromised from a pulmonary perspective, and the science isn't really out on that yet. But so that's another side to this, is that, if we continue to pollute the way we do, we also compromise our ability to fight off pathogens as well, because we're compromising our immune systems. So I think, as I said towards the end of my chat, there's a couple of things that come out of this. And one is that if we can see there's a direct relationship via this natural experiment, if you want to call it, of pursuing more active forms of transportation. I hear anecdotally that bicycles are flying off the shelves and bicycle shops have never been busier, which is a great thing. Not everybody can bike, of course, but walking and enjoying the outdoors as they can without driving around. It begins to start changing the discourse, particularly in urban areas, around the importance of active transportation and what infrastructure we could be investing in, rather than some of the more archaic industries that we do invest in, like fossil fuel industries and so on. Could we be investing more in infrastructure and those commercial applications in active transportation and public transportation to maintain this overall reduction in air pollution, which inevitably will result in health benefits in the long run. And then more, linked to that, of course, I've talked about air pollution, but I mean, all of these have associated carbon emissions as well. And that truly is the sort of elephant in the room. It's disheartening for many, many weeks to read, see the CBC News. Sorry, Lisa, for banging on your old compatriots there, but every story was about COVID. Like nothing else in the whole world was happening except for COVID, which is important because it was an important issue. But we forget that there's lots of other things going on in the world, and the biggest challenge we have as a species right now is, as I said, how we redefine our relationship with the natural world. And to date, all indications is that we're not doing a great job in our relationship. One person in the relationship is not acting very well, and the other person's about to take off, and the relationship may not be maintained in the long run. And so the climate change is really a symptom of, as you increase emissions, and we know that relates to increasing temperature and so on. As we do this, we know that there are going to be impacts, and those will be health impacts as well, and many other impacts, particularly for vulnerable populations. So I really do see this as a potentially a catalyst almost for thinking about how, not only how do we recover economically from this current situation, how do we think about how human beings interact with each other moving forward, but also redefining how human beings interact with the natural environment and aligning some of our economic policies and other policies to overcome some of these challenges.
Okay, we've got another question. This one's from Key on Facebook. Any insights on impact of pandemic on long-term care facilities in context of space and home?
I could talk about that a little bit, because the Northwood Long-Term Care Facility, which is the location of, the greatest outbreak of COVID-19 in Nova Scotia, is in my constituency. I think it's important to recognize that long-term care facilities, for the people living in them, are their homes. And again, it's another aspect of the social market housing kind of, spectrum, which can include co-ops, can include public housing, it can include land trusts. It's another aspect of that in which we haven't invested adequately. And particularly in the case of Northwood, the administrators and the board there, because it is a nonprofit long-term care facility, have been asking for years for capital investment in order to move from double occupancy and triple occupancy rooms to single occupancy rooms, because of their concerns around infection control, and because it was built in the 1960s. And just as we've seen, you know, an unwillingness to invest in other forms of public nonprofit housing, we've also seen, you know, those proposals kind of land on deaf ears, unfortunately, with the government, and that's unfortunate. And whether, you know, if they had gotten a yes in 2017, would they have had those single occupancy rooms? Would that have, you know, absolutely prevented the spread of this infection? I don't think we know that. It's, you know, it's really hard to play with those, you know, counterfactual scenarios, but certainly it would have made it easier once the infection had arrived in the facility to respond and to prevent further spread. I think there's no question that, you know, from everything I can understand as a complete, you know, not a health scientist at all, it seems like this virus is kind of really strange and acts in difficult to predict ways, and the long period before people show symptoms makes it very difficult. And I think a lot of things were on us before we realized. But those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, we have another question this one's from Jillian. Interested on Robin's thoughts on designing urban spaces to support biking post-pandemic.
Yeah, great question. I think I would like a lot of it to happen like during the pandemic to inform what happens post-pandemic. So I think it would make sense to, you know, if your city has existing cycling infrastructure, to use that within the plan of what to do next. And that what to do next part would be, I think, you know, creating a network of cycling infrastructure. Little pieces of cycling infrastructure here and there isn't too useful. And I think that's what actually informs a lot of the discourse in cities around, oh, you know, no one uses the infrastructure. It's because it doesn't really do much. It gives you 2 seconds of safety. So yeah, I think moving quickly, you can use adaptable materials. I don't like using the word cheap materials, but cheap materials that we can use in like the sense of a pilot. Both Calgary and Edmonton set some really good examples around using pilot materials to develop a downtown cycle track network. They did it pretty quickly in relative to how things had previously been done, but they did it in a few months. I think we can probably do this a lot quicker than that. But they did it in a way that allowed for iteration. And I think that, you know, a lot of cities are big into this idea of being smart cities or innovative cities. And to me, innovation is all about trying new things and adapting quickly. So, and I think one more piece that I think is really important, you know, I've spent a lot of time in European cities that are often celebrated for having good cycling infrastructure, and it almost seems like it's impossible in the Canadian context. But I think what's actually quite exciting is if you look around most Canadian cities, we have really wide roads. So we have space to work with, and a lot of older cities, particularly in Europe and in Asia, I mean, the roads are quite narrow, you know, so it's really hard to outfit those roads with cycling infrastructure. So moving forward, I think, you know, look at the network in your city, and also, like I mentioned before, you know, do ensure that it serves all communities, not just the affluent, you know, downtown core communities. But if we really want to create a sea change here, we have to create an environment that facilitates everyone's movement, and that's how you'll get more people on their bikes, and then that's how you can start that process of change that we often, you know, celebrate in countries like the Netherlands or in Denmark.
Okay, we have a question from Tristan. How about turning cemeteries into better public space? Many of the parks in downtown Montreal used to be cemeteries. During the pandemic, people have been using cemeteries as more. Would anyone like to comment on kind of changing cemeteries into public space?
I don't know that they need to be changed to be used. I mean, what I've found and noticed during this time is that those little bits of space that previously we would not resort to have become places that we use. And until the cemetery gates were actually closed, which I think they were in the context of the closure of parks in Halifax, they were also spaces, spaces that you could run in and spaces that you could walk through, and shortcuts. I love shortcuts. And especially like shortcuts that haven't been, prescribed and laid out, but that you kind of feel like you can find. So I live, for folks in Halifax, kind of at the edge of the car lots in the uncool part of the north end of Halifax. But if I want to get from here to Fairview, I absolutely would take the cemetery as a way to get there. So I don't know if it needs to be planned or if we need to raise headstones. I don't think so. And I don't think we get buy-in for that, but we can certainly appreciate them.
I just want to kind of build on that really quickly. I think one thing to consider when it comes to anything from the active transportation infrastructure we're building or converting cemeteries to be more public spaces is just to do it with a lens of accessibility. I think people with disabilities tend to fall outside or aren't acknowledged. So simple things like curb cuts, how can, are paths accessible? Some paths might be dirt. And I think, one other simple thing could be is just create more seating in these spaces or public bathrooms if we really want them to be public spaces. Yeah, I think most cities drastically lack both seating and washrooms, and even moving forward, I think public bathrooms are going to be increasingly important. I think I saw something on Twitter yesterday where they talked about how public bathrooms are necessary to keep people's hands clean and all whatnot. So, yeah.
I think the only thing that I would add would be to for folks to also to consider that these may be spaces where people practice their spirituality. And so we'd have to be very mindful of how we create that space. If we were to make some changes or modifications in some way, how do we maintain the sanctity of that space in terms of, the creating pathways that are more complementary to the graves that are there. Those are people's resting places, and so I personally wouldn't want to, I guess, be in that space and disrespect that space. So that would be something that I would consider.
So I have a question for you, Lisa, from somebody's just sent one to me. Given the financial implications affecting municipal, provincial and federal governments, how can government strategies and resources be focused on adequate housing for our communities? It was not being addressed prior to the pandemic, so how can we assure that change occurs going into the future?
Well, one thing I think that we will never be able to say again is that, public investment or public spending is impossible. I mean, that's what we've been hearing for years, and COVID-19 has made it clear that we have capacity. We have capacity, and what it takes is political will. And I think the health implications of 50% of or 20% of Nova Scotian households spending more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities may not be so obvious if you're not in that group, but there are actual health implications. There are population health implications, and so I think we call. I think we call the lie when we're told that it's impossible for us to invest, be it in bike lanes, be it in new social market housing, be it in adequate transit, whatever it is. I think be it in accessibility. I think we say no. We've seen that the government is capable, and it is ultimately about political will.
I think this next question, which isn't directed at anybody in particular, but I think also kind of touches on some of that issue of political will. So what are some key ways to support people in maintaining some of the values developed or increasing during COVID? So things like biking, outdoor play, walking post-pandemic. So I don't know who wants to kick off responding to that one.
I'll give it a try. I'm and Robin, you might be as well. I'm an advocate for leisure education. I think that there's an opportunity for us, particularly the professionals, but also just general opportunity for us to have some discussions around how do we educate folks around the importance of recreation and leisure and creating spaces where that can happen. We can, we have, an opportunity to reevaluate educational curriculum throughout the, primary school years and whatnot. We're trying to, advocate for play and all of those things in the younger years. So I think it's a really important time, a critical time for us to really start thinking about how we create a society that's not only physically literate, but leisure literate. And how can we create the infrastructure for that within our education system and beyond that.
I just want to make a quick point. I think what I'm seeing, actually, my sister's partner is a rep for a big bike company, and he's been saying, yeah, but like I think Daniel was speaking to that maybe, but the idea that bikes are flying off the shelves right now. So I would think that a lot of that cycling is probably recreation and leisure focused, and I think if cities want to capitalize on this new kind of influx of new cyclists, it's building that network of cycling infrastructure, because a lot of these people are arguably not, I mean, even the most seasoned cyclists in some of our cities experiences a lot of stress trying to get around. And so, I mean, my hope would be that, by building the infrastructure, that we start giving people an idea of cycling as a viable way to just travel through their city instead of driving. And I think that a lot of the challenges that, the progressive or the open-minded politicians out there who do want cycling infrastructures, that they deal with a lot of pushback from residents who have, likely because these residents actually haven't seen what this could look like. And I think that we need to normalize these alternate ways of, compared to driving, these alternate ways of moving through our cities. And there's a huge opportunity in front of us here.
I was going to add to that, something I've been thinking about for a long time as an avid cyclist, not just for recreation, but also as a form of transportation, although I will admit I don't travel very far on a bicycle. So anyway, I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen. And I think thinking about how to modify context, as Robin was alluding to create opportunities to make it easier for people to cycle is definitely a way forward. And there are a lot of cities such as in Calgary and Halifax and other areas that are working through streetscaping projects that will, I hope, try and incorporate some of those modifications. There's been some really good examples too of population level interventions to promote changing behavior. So some of you may remember the Carrot app that was on smartphones for a long time, or a couple of years. And it actually used Daniel Kahneman's ideas, which is you nudge people into changing behavior by offering them rewards for modifying the behavior, but the rewards are aligned with rewards that they feel are useful to them in everyday life. So in this app, for example, people would be able to, it's no longer available now because the provincial governments didn't want to fund it anymore, which is a shame. But what would happen is if you reach so many steps per day or whatever the measurement was, you would get a gift card for, unfortunately, something like Petro-Canada, or to go spend money somewhere else. There's been a couple of recent papers that have come out analyzing that intervention. It's extremely successful, I think partially because the rewards are aligned with our culture. The rewards are aligned with things people already identify with. People are already collecting points at the grocery store. They're doing these things. And so it's just saying, well, I can collect points and be active at the same time. So we could start thinking more creatively about how to promote physical activity. Cycling is one of those ways, but as an integrated system in an active transportation system that includes public transit cycling, walking, running, and so on as well. So that's another way of thinking. Is there a way of incentivizing and nudging through technology to do that? And I think there is. And then the other way too is incentivizing behavior, not just through apps like that, but incentivizing behaviors that reduce carbon emissions. And the reality is that in Canada, we tend to politically penalize people for emissions. So, and that's fine. That's the structures we've set up over many years. It would be nice to see some creative policy making around incentivizing reduction in emissions, so that people are rewarded for steps they take. Sometimes I think many of us, maybe on the panel and those who are calling in, you may feel like sometimes, why is it I'm the only one who seems to care about this issue or that issue when it comes to, look at me, I've been cycling for a year and no one seems to care. It would be nice to have a system or some policies in place that identify those kinds of activities that people are taking to reduce their emissions, incentivize it by maybe providing discounts to bicycles or discounts to things and so on. And at the same time, also penalizing behaviors that result in excessive emissions. So surely by now we can calculate what is an appropriate emission level for households or for individuals if Canada is going to achieve its goals, emission reduction targets. Surely that's attainable for different sectors in our society. And I think it would be nice to see a more integrated approach to both incentivizing and at the same time taxing, for example, to achieve some of those emission goals. So those are just a few ideas that popped into my head.
Great. Thank you. And on a related note, actually another couple of questions, but we may only have time to answer one, depending on how much you talk on this one. But there was a study done on biking in Toronto a few years ago. It noted that there is a big difference between urban and suburban biking. What can we do to better integrate suburban and integrate suburban into biking networks? Fixing cities is not going to get people out of their cars and onto bikes. Relatedly, I think this might be aimed at you, Robin, because it says, does he think suburbanites are adequately included in these bike conversations? But I think you, Daniel, could have something to say about this as well.
Go ahead, Robin.
Okay. Yeah, I think I am so in support of including suburbanites in this conversation. I think what's happened in a lot of cities is that they, obviously you want to start where there's high population density in the core of the city, but that creates a sense of ostracization of people who are on the outskirts of the city. And then you get these conversations around my taxes are going to other people, things that I can't use, even though, roads are, everyone pays for roads. But I think, like I was mentioning earlier, creating a network of cycling infrastructure. And obviously maybe, someone can't bike. I want to bike an hour and a half into the core of the city. So then thinking about ways to integrate that with transit, is there bike parking at transit? Can people bring their bikes on transit? Prior to this whole pandemic, I was living in Kitchener because I'm at the University of Waterloo, and they just start Kitchener's the region of Waterloo is the smallest city with an LRT. And it's nice you can bring your bicycles on the LRT. And so that's a way of kind of solving that last mile problem and getting people perhaps who may not typically access the city by bike by giving them a way to, to take a break and have a nice experience on transit. So I think, building a network and also thinking of ways of integrating existing transportation infrastructure into cycling infrastructure.
I guess I have nothing much to add to that except for something I thought of that relates to that too from my last comment, which is it's like a lot of interventions in public health and in other areas. I think a lot of this is about changing culture. And we all know that there are different cultures depending on where you live in urban areas and different cultures in rural areas and so on. I think a lot of us share similar values. But things that, recreation ambassadors or other ambassadors, people, there are municipal ambassadors that work for Halifax that expose people to different aspects of the city. And we need more, maybe there's a way of developing programs to create ambassadors in different neighborhoods or in different regions around urban areas. And with a task or a goal of promoting cycling and invigorating interest in other people around cycling, and sometimes I think that goes a long way in trying to change culture. And I think it's one of the hardest aspects to change in society is changing culture. As we've known with tobacco as an issue for many years, it's been a long time coming and changing the culture around it. And we can see with vaping how easy it is to slip back in time with that. But I think I have seen, in the 20 years I've lived in Halifax, and then I've lived in Edmonton and Vancouver and other cities, I've seen a lot more cyclists now than I ever have before. So I know things are changing, but I think it could be bolstered by thinking about how do we be a little more creative about how to change that culture from moving from the private automobile to cycling, which isn't for everybody all year round, we have to admit.
Great, thank you. I think we've probably run out of time now. We've got 5 more minutes to go. I would just add something myself to that, having bought an e-bike last year, which you have to see as a replacement of a car. You cannot see it as just another bike because they aren't cheap. It has revolutionized my life. I go further and faster, and I think that's a really amazing way forward. But as I say, they're not really that cheap. But I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for your very thoughtful contributions to today's panel. We really wanted to focus on places and spaces in the pandemic and post-pandemic, and I think you've each brought something really unique and very valuable to the conversation. I just want to say thanks to all the audience for listening. I have it open here, and I can see that we've actually kept an audience all the way, well, most of the way through this actually. So I think that's another real value and positive. So thanks again. It's really strange in these things not to be able to give you a clap, but yeah, I really appreciate your wonderful contributions to the, oh, there you go, the wonderful contributions to the event. And so thank you on behalf of the HPI, the MacEachen Institute, and Dalhousie alumni for your contributions today. Yeah.